Yeah, hello, Rabbi.
Hi.
I'm going to try. I'm having some computer issues this morning. I'm going to try to uh, see if I can't get this on my computer and have to. I may have to restart the computer. The camera
Okay.
is really funky all of a sudden. Um, I just got to find the. I got to find the link again.
All
Uh,
right. Well, do what you need to do.
yeah, there we go. Now
Okay.
it will open up better if I can get my camera back. Um,
No, we see you.
okay, I can see my. Let's see what happens.
We can see and hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, it looks like okay. Whatever. I don't know if it was a teaching program I'm on or what. Okay, I'm gonna get off my phone.
Okay. So welcome everybody. Hope that this finds you well. A couple of housekeeping things. First of all, I sent out an email to as many email addresses as I could find this past week with um, uh, documents from the first couple of classes and also the links from the classes we've had so far. Did any of you receive those?
I did.
Okay. Terrific. Okay. If you did not receive it, I'm more than happy to send it along if you'd be so kind to include your email. If you could put your email, so Jason, if you perhaps could put your email into the group chat, perfect, and thank you. So I will forward you that and then include you in upcoming emails. The idea is to send something, if possible, early in the week or midweek to say, all right, here are the documents that we went through in the previous class. Here are the links to prior classes, so that you have everything. So I'll forward the one that I sent earlier, and then you'll be on the list going forward. I still am. I still am trying to figure out the best way to do a syllabus, but I do intend to put something together. It's part of the challenge is trying to envision how best to um, what pace I should go on because which I left it deliberately vague as far as what pace we should go on. But I think with reason because I want to see what the want to see how people are responding and everything like that. Um, but what I but hopefully the next couple of weeks you'll have something and then see if you want to continue moving forward with it, which I hope you do. So as for today, what I decided I wanted to do was to continue on the journey of sacred texts. Now, we talked last time about the Tanakh, about the Hebrew Bible, and about what you can find in those books. And then I want to today is as best we can go through um, the sort of the structure and the basic context of several other sacred volumes that came out in the thousands of years past the Tanakh. So that's no small goal, obviously, because that's a lot of time. But what I want to convey is the idea that when it comes to the Judaism that is practiced, and I would say that this is true for Orthodox, conservative, Reform Jews all over the map, is that no matter how much the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh are the foundational texts of our tradition, we are by far much more rabbinic Jews than we are Jews of the Torah. Again, the Torah is the one that started it all. We wouldn't have it at all if it weren't for the Torah. but the way it develops, the way it evolves. I call this on YouTube, I'm calling this the evolution of law. This is you'll find it's actually quite um, it moves forward quite a bit. I mention in the book of Deuteronomy the passage about, I think I've mentioned this before, about if you have a rebellious teenager. I think I talked about this in the first session, right? So to me, that's one of the ultimate examples of that. Um, and we should probably go back to that idea for just a moment as to figure out how some of the rabbis dealt with it, how some of the rabbis were trying to make it so that that law no longer applied. However, it did, but it was still, in all essence, wipe it off the books. It was wiped off the books. So we'll get to that in a moment. But first of all, what do I mean when I say rabbis? Because, when I mention rabbis, I mean, you see that, I have that title for myself, right? I went to school between 1999 and 2005, and I have the title of rabbi. I earned it from a fairly, from an established institution known as the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is in New York City. So I'm a rabbi. So when I talk about the rabbis, what am I speaking of? And I grant you that it is somewhat of a vague term, but usually when I'm talking about the rabbis, what I'm talking about is what I'm talking about are the religious leaders of the first several centuries of the Common Era. And by Common Era, I'm referring to what some people refer to as AD, as the centuries AD, but I prefer using Common Era and before Common Era, CE and BCE. Um, that's generally what we're talking about. So uh, there is nothing in the Torah that says, how do you become a rabbi? There's no guidepost for that. And frankly, there's no such thing as a rabbi at that time, right? Um, the religious leaders of that age, the initial religious leaders, were the priests. They were what's known in Hebrew as the Kohanim. The Kohanim were the religious leaders because the system of religious worship was that of sacrificial offerings. And the Kohanim were responsible for offering and coordinating these sacrificial offerings. They had other jobs too, but those were that was the big job. Now, that job was 100% dependent on the temple in Jerusalem being in operation. It was entirely dependent on that. Without a temple, the Kohanim were basically rendered powerless. Why was that? The Torah and the other and also throughout the Tanakh talks about the idea of when you do your worship, you worship in the place that God tells you. Meaning, worship in that time was at the designated spot. Worship was not a mobile enterprise. You worshiped at that particular place at that time. Worship meant you offered sacrifice specifically at the temple. If you were, and you weren't supposed to be doing sacrifice. You couldn't just set up an altar in your backyard and just say, "Hey, I'm going to offer this worship to God." That wasn't allowed. It had to be done through the Kohanim in Jerusalem. So that worked for centuries before the Common Era. The Second Temple was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era.
Hold on. You
Yes,
say
please.
that quote unquote worked for several centuries, but wasn't that kind of an undue, or I shouldn't put an adjective in front of the word hardship, for many people who had to make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to observe the sacrifice?
Certainly it was a major schlep. There's no question. And yeah, and and that's a fair critique, because I would say that, did it work? I would say maybe a better way to say is the system remained intact. It wasn't necessarily great for everybody, but it lasted. How about that? So Mark asked about, do people know what the Kohanim is? So Kohanim were essentially, they were understood to be descendants of the tribe of Levi, of the Israelite tribe of Levi, Levi being one of Jacob's 12 sons. And they were a subset of that group. They were thought to be descendants of Aaron, who was Moses' brother. And the idea is that a Kohen was somebody who and at the time it was only men. And the Kohen had to be a literal descendant of people from that family. Mark Foreman saying, even today, attending religious activity is not convenient to everybody. No, we're still working it out. It's true. We're still working out the kinks. Fair point. So, okay. So, in other words, for better or for worse.
And the Kohanim were priests. They had this priestly
Right.
duties that are outlined in the Torah, I guess.
100%. Yeah. So they had these duties. They had uniforms. They had specific codes of conduct that applied only to them. I mean, they were, it was it was rarefied air, if you will. It was very specific stuff. So, okay, now there's no more temple. Almost 2,000 years ago, no more temple, and there hasn't been one since. What do we do? Now, it wasn't quite this immediate. The crisis was not as immediate as I think sometimes we portray it to be. It's not like the temple is destroyed in the summer of 70 CE, and then the next day everybody's saying, "Oh my gosh, what do we do now?" The question was pertinent probably a good couple hundred years prior to that point, as the system of the temple was beginning to decline in influence. And there were different reasons for that. Part of it had to do with reduced political influence and power among Jews living in the state of Israel, especially as when the Roman Empire essentially took control. And also because the quote unquote the office of the Kohanim was becoming corrupted. There began to be suddenly Kohanim, and even Kohanei Gadol, meaning high priest, like the guy in charge, who weren't necessarily actually Kohanim at all. They paid money for the privilege. It was sort of a pay-to-play thing for a number of Kohanim. Some things never change, right? But you had this. And essentially, at least among many Israelites, when you compounded with the inconvenience of schlepping all the way to Jerusalem a few times a year, depending on where you lived, there was this feeling of, all right, who are these Schmendricks who are in charge, right? That's a direct quote. No, no, it's not. But the idea. So what happened was people began to take some matters into their own hands. They began to not rebel completely against it, but they began to say, all right, well, if things aren't working great in Jerusalem at the temple, let's at least try to maintain our tradition wherever we are. And the way they did that was to return indulgence is the Catholic tradition. Probably some similar instincts. I mean, perhaps. Yeah, I hadn't made that connection, but it's possible. Yeah. Um, so essentially, so what did if you're a Jew living in, let's say, the north part of what is now Israel, and you're living a several day journey by foot or by donkey or whatever, by horse from Jerusalem. What is what do you have? You don't necessarily have you can't do sacrifices where you are, but you do have knowledgeable people around you. You had teachers, and those teachers would teach from the sacred books, from the Tanakh, and then begin to offer thoughts about how those laws applied to our everyday lives. That's who you had. And these teachers became known as rabbis. Rabbi means teacher. So you have, for instance, dating back to the 2nd century before the Common Era, stories about a rabbi, for instance, named Hillel, and another rabbi named Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were, in a sense, rivals with one another. They would interpret certain laws, and a lot of the time, they would interpret them completely differently from one another. And uh, and Hillel was often the one who was the one almost always followed, as opposed to Shammai. But there was respect between the rabbis and their followers. Um, and they were far from the only rabbis beginning to get a following. And they began to communicate to one another what became known as the oral law. Now, why was it oral specifically? It was oral because, well, literacy rates weren't that high at that time. And also, I mean, so in other words, like when it came to writing things down, I mean, being a scribe was a specialized position. So you didn't have a lot of people to write things down, and the cost of books was exorbitant. I mean, think about what it was to publish books before the printing press. Not cheap.
Sorry,
So
Rabbi. Are you saying that Hillel and Shammai communicated the oral law to each other or to the people that followed them?
to their respective followers, although there is a sense that Hillel and Shammai had, I don't know how much there was interaction between the two people per se, but there was a sort of a mutual respect among the two people and among their followers. oftentimes you see it quoted Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit meaning house, like the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai, meaning essentially their followers, their students, etc. So these were these were only like two examples of rabbis who began to teach law orally to people, as was a common way of education in that time anyway. Yes, Catherine.
Question.
Yeah.
I'm probably skipping ahead a few centuries, but much is made of the artwork that decorates most of the Christian world's churches, cathedrals, etc., that is to educate the people who weren't literate. So I can't remember, what's the tradition in Judaism about using decorative arts to help illustrate stories and teachings?
It's more restricted, partially because the idea of at least certainly in synagogues, which we'll get to in a second, synagogues, like as far as having images of human beings, right? Because you're not supposed to have graven images, right? So lest we think that we are bowing toward this this image of, let's say, Abraham or Moses or what have you. So you don't have a lot of, you're not really supposed to have, a lot of, certainly in prayer spaces, you're not supposed to have any, pictures of actual human beings. Although, so there are some, there are some, ancient synagogues in which that have been unearthed in recent centuries, where the tile work, where the designs on the tiles are ornate and gorgeous, and so incredibly just beautiful. And so I imagine there may have been some through that, but they were working with more restrictions. Yeah, so good question. Um, so okay, so these rabbis began to be leaders in local communities. And when the temple was destroyed, now getting back to that, right, when the priesthood basically lost any semblance of power, the rabbis were ready to step in. They were ready to step in as leaders. Now, there was not at any point one chief rabbi over all of Judaism. There were probably rabbis who thought they were, but there was no one actually appointing anyone to be the rabbi. So essentially, you had rabbis of communities, and this is essentially what we do today. We have, like for instance, when a congregation chooses a rabbi, that rabbi is the one who makes decisions on Jewish law for that community, or they're the final say. That is sort of part of the responsibility of being a rabbi of a congregation, of a community. And then I want to mention about synagogues, because again, the temple cult losing its influence, losing adherence, just in general, there's just a lot less confidence in that institution. So how would you worship if you couldn't get to Jerusalem and couldn't go to a temple? Well, okay. Well, they started to look around. They started to say, all right, well, we can't offer sacrifices, but we do still have Tanakh. So let's pick some passages out of the Tanakh that we can put into, that we can recite on a daily basis. And so they chose certain passages. And we'll get into more about what those passages are when we talk about prayer, which is a whole other topic. And then from there, they began to determine rituals of, well, all right, let's do a ritual reading from a scroll of the Torah. And so you began to have these ritual services in which people would recite prayers. They began to recite prayers um, that were passages from the Tanakh and or poetry that was written inspired by those passages. And then in many cases, they would say, all right, well, let's read from the Tanakh. Let's do a ritual reading. Let's open a scroll and let's say blessings over it, etc. And let's find a place to do that, a place where we can regularly meet. Those became synagogues. And again, it was it's important to note, this was essentially kind of an underground movement for a while. It wasn't, again, I wouldn't say that it was in, direct defiance of the system of sacrifices, but it was just sort of an alternate way of doing things that traditionalists had little control over if they'd wanted to squash the whole uh, movement down. It would have been very difficult to do so. So now, in the absence of a temple, synagogues were ready to take a prime spot in Jewish communities, and rabbis were primed to be leaders of said synagogues and of said communities. So it was not an overnight transformation, but these rabbis became the thought leaders, as well as in some cases, even just the political leaders of said communities in terms of advocating for the needs of the community. So so let's get back to the idea of oral law, and then I'm going to open up a document in a couple minutes that will start to talk about what the oral law is, because it's the idea of oral law is kind of a misnomer, because they would communicate this. They would communicate their interpretations of what the practical implications of Torah law meant. So, for instance, what does the Torah say about observing the Sabbath? Not all that much. It says in Genesis that you rest on the seventh day, just as God rested after 6 days of creation. You say that, like there's a part where it says you can't light a fire on the Sabbath, can't do it. And then there's also, you can't carry items from one domain to another. There's not much more when it comes to explaining what you're supposed to do to rest on the Sabbath. It says that everybody's supposed to do it. Everybody in the community is supposed to do it. Even the animals are supposed to rest. So those animals, in other words, like if you're like, you can't be plowing. All right. So there are some things you're able to kind of imply, but there are other things where it's not necessarily clear. It's not crystal clear, at least, what the Torah means by don't work on the Sabbath. So the rabbis would talk to their congregants, their constituents, their students, and they would pass along orally what sort of things you're supposed to do and not do in order to observe the Sabbath in terms of just practical questions. All right, it can't light a fire, but what if this happens? What if that happens? Says you can't work. Okay, well, what constitutes work? Right? Um, can I can I use money to purchase something? Can I it's like when it's like if I have a stick, can I whittle the stick? Can I chop wood? Can I like all these different questions, right? That weren't necessarily clear based on the laws of the Torah because there was just very little written there. So the oral laws passed down from generation to generation. And then you have a character named Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince, or I mean, I guess in modern parlance it would be Judah the artist formerly known as the Prince, but that would be a different thing. Um, uh, Yehuda Hanasi looked at the landscape of the Jewish world. And he said, okay, we've been passing down these oral laws now for multiple centuries. The Jewish world is getting more and more fragmented geographically. Because you see, when the Roman Empire destroyed the temple, almost all, not all, but a good chunk of Jews had to leave. They left Israel. Now, some of them stuck around, but a lot of them left, and a lot of them went to the thriving Jewish communities of Babylonia. Those that had been established after the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians centuries before. So in Babylonia, there were plenty of Jews doing things, and there were already rabbis and synagogues and academies and things like that. But it was never entirely safe to necessarily settle in one place long term. And so Jews were being spread out more and more across the known Western world. So Yehuda Hanasi said, you know, we got to start writing some of this down. We have to. So he began to gather as many of these oral laws as he could find. Now, whether it was all him or whether it was him and his students, not always clear, but he was certainly the driving force behind it. Yehuda Hanasi lived around the year 200 of the Common Era. So now I'm going to open up this document and share the screen to start to go into the next great Jewish text, which was his brainchild. Okay. Now, this is a pamphlet. This is actually not the most recent thing. It's kind of I kind of find this whole thing very charming in terms of in terms of all this. But this is a document, and I will include it, of essentially the development, the evolution of Jewish law as described in these sacred texts. So we talked about Torah last time, and this actually gives you a pretty good idea of what's in the Torah. When it says a page from the Torah, I'm going to get back to this at some point. What I want to do is I want to start talking about what became known as the Talmud. So the Talmud began with Yehuda Hanasi, who came up with collections of teachings, and he put those into 6 categories, 6 sidarim, or orders, if you will. Those orders are called zra'im. Zra'im literally means seeds. Moed, which refers to sacred time. Nashim, women. Nizikin, which really has to do with civil law. Kodashim, about certain holy items. And Tahorot, which has to do with purity, especially among the priests and the assistants of the priests, the Levites. Now, it should be mentioned real quick that these teachings, there are a bunch of teachings still about the responsibilities of the priests, of the Kohanim. They talk a lot about it, because think about the time period. We now know that it's been almost 2,000 years since there's been a temple. In the first few centuries after the destruction of the temple, no one knew that it was going to be at least 1,000, a couple thousand years and counting before there might even be a temple again. They thought, well, maybe soon. Who knows? Maybe next week, or maybe next year, whatever it is. Like, there was still this idea of, we may be going back to this. So there's quite a bit of discussion regarding that. So Yehuda Hanasi basically created this anthology of teachings and put them in these categories. Now, there are going to be a couple phrases here that may be a little confusing. So I'm going to try my best to explain that. So, okay, there's a lot going on this page. Again, I'm going to share this, and there's a lot to go through. And please understand, I do not need you to figure all this out. What Yehuda Hanasi put together, or he and his colleagues or students, whatever it is, around the year 200, is known as the Mishnah. So where it says here, number 1, the Mishnah, if you look at this page of the Talmud, the part where it says 1 and what follows below, that is one example. That is one particular teaching from the Mishnah. Okay. That's what Yehuda Hanasi did. Now, as you can imagine, once Yehuda Hanasi and his followers published the Mishnah, at that point, every possible question had been answered, and no one had any more questions ever again about how to observe Jewish law. You know I am kidding. Of course, there were more questions. In fact, there were probably 10 times as many questions as there were things that they answered. More discussion took place. Over the course of the next 300 or so years, the rabbis of those centuries talked about, debated, questioned, and in some cases, even uprooted or adjusted mightily the teachings in the Mishnah. They would talk about that over the course of the next 300 or so years. So between the years 200 and 500 of the Common Era, approximately. And then around the year 500-ish, the leaders of those communities began to say, we should really write this stuff down. They probably were writing a lot of it down. But in other words, like we need to gather up all our notes and we need to publish it. So the Mishnah has a counterpart known here as the Gemara. Now, so the definition here is the Gemara or Talmud. Well, okay, I don't know if I'd call it Talmud, or we'll get to that. The Gemara is the collected discussions of the rabbis who lived after the Mishnah was completed. They were called the Amoraim, and there are two different editions of the Gemara. One is known as the Yerushalmi, which involved discussions of people who lived in the land of Israel, people who stayed after the destruction of the temple. And then there's the Babylonian Talmud, which is frankly where most Jews went, to Babylonia, to Babylon. Now, the Yerushalmi Talmud, very few people study it. Why? It's not that we weren't interested in anything that these rabbis in Israel had to say. It's just that a lot of what it had to do were laws of agriculture specific to the land of Israel. So if you lived in the land of Israel, yeah, you'd be looking at this a lot. If you didn't live in Israel, you weren't that interested. The Babylonian Talmud is much, much larger. So I know I'm throwing a lot of terms out there. And so what I'm going to do to hopefully simplify it a little bit is I'm going to stop with sharing this document and move to something and do something else. Hold on a second. Okay. So let's see here. I'm going to go to a whiteboard. Okay. All right. So let me try to kind of break it down a little bit. You have Mishnah, which is approximately the year 200 of the Common Era. And it was put together by Yehuda Hanassi. I'm sorry. My handwriting isn't this bad usually, but it's not great on a screen. Okay. Now, the Gemara that's from the years around 200 to 500 of the Common Era. And these are these expound on the Mishnah. When you add it up together, the collection of Mishnah plus the collection of Gemara equals the Talmud. I'm going to take a screenshot of this, even though, again, please forgive my handwriting. That, I think, is a pretty good summary, or at least like a basic summary of this. The combination of Mishnah and Gemara is the Talmud. Now, why is the Talmud so important? The Talmud is important, I think, because not just because it is a collection of law. It's also because it's everything. It's essentially a document of what Jewish life was like in the first 5 centuries of the Common Era, in all facets, in terms of how Jews lived, how they observed Judaism, what they thought, what they wished for. There's a bunch of stuff in there, in the Talmud, by the way, that is esoteric. There are things there that are legends. There are tall tales. There are stories about rabbis. And by the way, whoever edited the Talmud, especially the Gemara, the Gemara portion of the Talmud, whoever did that probably had ADHD. And the reason I say that, and this is not to take away from those who have ADHD, but what I mean by this is they zigzagged from topic to topic to topic to topic. For instance, you would think in an orderly, like if these books were meant to be simply an orderly explanation of this is how you follow this law, this is how you follow that law, you would think that there is a tractate, or there is at least a section that is, this is how you observe Hanukkah. Now, Hanukkah is not a major Jewish holiday. It's popular and not without its significance. But in terms of observance, you're allowed to do work on Hanukkah. So it's not in that same category as some of other festivals. Well, there's very little discussion about Hanukkah in the Talmud, and there are reasons behind that. But the key thing I want to point out is that the only reason why they brought up Hanukkah is because they were talking about the rules for lighting Shabbat candles. They were in the middle of talking about Shabbat and about what materials are appropriate to use when lighting candles to begin Shabbat. And they're like, and at some point, somebody goes, "Oh yeah, what is this Hanukkah thing?" And they say a little bit about Hanukkah, because that's another time where you light candles. And then they moved on. Right? You would think, for instance, if this were an orderly book of law, that there would be a section that said, here are rules and regulations regarding death and mourning. Would seem to make sense, right? Important part of the life cycle, an important thing that everybody deals with. There isn't a chapter that says that. It gets brought up when they talk about the intermediate days of the holidays of Sukkot and Passover. Why? Because there are modifications. There's supposed to be modifications to how you do a funeral service on those days. Okay, so while we're at it, yeah, so what are we supposed to do about sitting Shiva? What are we supposed to do about the stages of mourning, the stages of grief? What are we supposed to do about so that they talk about that then. It is and again, ADHD, I mentioned ADHD. I'm not trying to be derogatory either toward ADHD or the rabbis. Maybe a better way to say it is stream of consciousness to the nth degree. Think about when you have a long conversation with somebody you know well. Let's say this conversation goes about an hour or so. What are the odds that you're staying on one topic? Not high, right? And then what are the odds that even when you move from topic to topic, that there is a very clear line of how you got from one topic to the, I mean, usually those lines are thin, right? Where you'll say this and you'll say, oh, speaking of X, speaking of Y, let's talk about this. Like it just goes, it goes in so many different directions. Part of what is so uh, incredible about the Talmud is that you never know what they're going to say next. You never know what they're going to bring up. It's just they'll like there'll be a point where they'll say, oh, this rabbi said this. Well, that reminds me a story of that rabbi. And that reminds me of a story of and who is that rabbi? Who to whom should that rabbi be compared? Oh, that rabbi is compared to this other rabbi. Oh, let's talk about that. That's what we're talking about here. It's not, you know. So again, how would you edit this? Well, they didn't really edit it so much, or at least. I'm not saying it was all a rough draft, but at least what we have, the books, the Talmud that we have is, is not necessarily in what we might call strict logical order, put it that way. Which is why it's a lot more than simply a book of law. It is honestly a conversation about everything. Conversation about a lot of different things. Why is the Talmud considered such an important thing? I want to give a couple of reasons why. First of all, it's important not only as sort of a document of history, but also because somebody actually explained this to me in a way that I think is poignant, which is, the Tanakh that has been adopted by other religions as part of their sacred texts, right? Christians include the Hebrew Bible in their Bible. Muslims think of the Hebrew Bible as part of its sacred tradition. They add other things to it that maybe they give primacy to certain other things, but they have, they have included that. The Talmud is really like the Talmud, like that's ours. Like this is something that it's a distinctly Jewish text, and it remains so. Now, with that said, and I realize the next thing I'm going to say might be somewhat contradictory. The logic in trying to explain certain laws, the progression of logic, is in many ways some of the most complex it's some of the most complex thinking that we have in the entire um, that we have really in Jewish tradition or really many other places. My understanding, and I don't have much more information than just this statement, is that there is a practice among law students in South Korea to study passages of Talmud because the logic employed in Talmud is considered to be a tremendous example of how we use logic or how anyone can use logic to break things down to explain arguments, etc. I don't know how much of the Talmud they look at. I don't know how thorough how big of a part it is in their curriculum, but I think it is striking. The Talmud is a little bit of everything, and it sets the stage for what happens in centuries later in terms of in terms of other discussions of law. Yes, Betty Mark.
Um, so the Talmud is actually a fixed document and has been for centuries and centuries. Because I
Right.
know, I guess it was my thought that Talmudic discussions continued not only long after that time, but certainly halakhic discussions continue today. And it wasn't clear to me that the Talmud was finished. Uh,
Yeah.
clear at that time.
Yeah. The Talmud at this point is the Talmud is fixed. However, the like Talmudic discussion is really it's an expression referring to uh, sort of this uh, deep logical discourse that and sort of a push and pull that happens between people trying to understand law. That's so the idea of like having a Talmudic discussion is sort of more of a broader expression, I would say. Um, and then in addition, um, uh, discussions of law, oh, that absolutely continues to this day.
What
So,
what's how does Steinsaltz fit in all this?
Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who only passed away a couple years ago, I mean, pretty recently, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz was uh, one of the great, I think, our generation's plural great explainer, I guess, of Talmud. He published volumes of the Talmud that offer more in the way of context, explanation, and he probably did more to make the Talmud accessible than, I don't know. I mean, I can't think of anyone who did more, honestly. He's so
But
yeah,
he's still working with this document that was completed around 500.
right. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was, essentially. I mean, and if you look at the editions of Steinsaltz Talmud that have been published, it's really, I mean, the words are the same, but the explanations that he offers, he breaks it down in a way that makes the text, I think, a lot less mysterious for a lot of people. So why don't we cap it at this, and we will pick up next week with going a little further into talking about the way the Jewish law continues to develop, and because then that will lead us into matters of observance, and talking about things like Shabbat and keeping kosher and all these other things. Um, so I appreciate your inquiries, your thoughts, your attention. And feel free to email me with other questions or thoughts as we go along.
Rabbi, do you have time to chat for a minute or are you done? Ready?
So let me stop the YouTube stream, and then if you and I would like, yeah, you and I can talk, certainly. All right. Listen, wishing everybody a good wishing everybody a good week, and I'll be sending an email soon.
Thank you,
Thank
Rabbi.
you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Rabbi.